What did music sound like in the 1950s or the 1960s or 70s or 80s? Let's just confine it up to the 80s, right? What did it sound like then? Because it doesn't sound that way now. Uh, we can play recordings of that period, but when we play them back, we're playing it back over modern equipment, whether it's a Bluetooth speaker or a high-end audio system. We're not hearing it the way people heard it then, and that's what I'm thinking about today. What did music sound like to people in those decades, right? 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. Before I go any further, I just want to say about my shirt. Now, people ask about the shirts all the time. This shirt comes from a place in Brooklyn called the Audiophiliac Collection. I will link to their website below. I'm not getting paid for this. It's not a commercial. Just like their stuff. Anyway, so regarding the sound of music, well, it's a long, long time ago, right? But the closest I've gotten to hearing that was a few years ago. The nice folks at Sci-Fi Audio, specifically Fernando, he put together this 1970s system for me. He took it to New York City to Stereo Exchange. I will link to all this stuff below. But anyway, he put together this system from the 70s. It was a tannoy Arden speaker, with a big 15-inch concentric driver from mid-1970s, Audio Research preamp and power amp, also from the early to mid-1970s, a Garrard turntable, same period. The cartridge was a contemporary, modern cartridge. But that was about as good as I was going to get in terms of hearing what a 1970s system sounded like, and I brought along vinyl, LPs that were from that period. So from the record to the playback system, except for the cartridge, I was hearing it the way it was. And the way it was fantastic, actually. It wasn't modern sounding. It wasn't as pure and clean and transparent as a contemporary high-end system, because this was a high-end system of the 1970s, which is something in the 1970s very, very, very few people, including very, very few audiophiles, heard sound at that level. But that's what I got. It's a starting point in this mental game that I'm playing here, is what music sounded like then. And it had this big sound, big, warm, rich, dynamic, not much high-end detail, clarity, not much in transparency, but it was engaging, it was fun, it had great rhythm and pace, it moved right along. So that's what I got. Now, I'm 70 years old, so I do remember the 50s, but I don't remember the 50s, the sound of music in the 50s, except to say, well, what did people have to play music back on in the 1970s? And well, in the 50s, they had these things that they used to call consoles. It was a big, wide piece of furniture with a door that opened on top, and it had a turntable and a tuner. Sometimes the turntable was in a drawer, which is pretty weird to think about. But anyway, it had a turntable, a radio of some sort, and big speakers, and tube electronics, I'm sure, for the most part. And the sound, is thick and rich and, mushy sounding, but fun, comforting, kind of like comfort food equivalent, just like an easy, sweet, enveloping, juicy sound. That's the way I remember the 50s. And I believe I've been asking around for people who are older than me to tell me their memories, and I haven't found anybody really step up. So if you're out there and you're old, even older than me, and you remember the sound of the 50s with some clarity, please put that in the comments section below. But by the 60s, I do remember. And 1960s audio was not bassy. The stuff that kids had, it was basically mid-rangey and kind of bright, and there were these close-and-play systems with a box with a turntable and then speakers that folded out from the box or detached from the box. That's what the average teenager would have. That's what, I wouldn't say everybody, but a lot of people had those kinds of systems. So the point of this ramble today is to think in terms of these decades. What were the engineers thinking? Who was their market? Who were they recording and mixing and mastering this music for? Well, if it was rock and roll, they were doing it mostly for teenagers, right? And they knew the kind of playback systems those kids had, and they were going to hear that music on the radio over a little crappy mono little speaker in the car in the 50s and 60s. Cars, it was mono, it was a little oval paper speaker, no tweeter, it was mid-rangey, it could play sort of loud but be generally distorted or not very good, right? So if you're making records in the 50s and 60s and you're thinking, how are the kids going to hear this music? They're going to hear it over pretty iffy home system, turntable and speakers at home or in their car. Oh, and also in jukeboxes. And jukeboxes were not exactly the epitome of transparency, right? Boomy, thick, distorted sounding devices for music playback. But fun, Remember, you have to think of this in the context of the time, not like what things sound like now. We have to think about what it was like then. And believe me, nobody was complaining. We were all happy campers. We all had got a lot out of music. We danced to it. We had fun with it. It was a blast, right? So the thing is, it changes, right? But they weren't thinking in the 50s and 60s like, what is this Buddy Holly going to sound like in the year 2019? This was not a primary concern for recording engineers of any genre of music, of rock and roll or jazz or even classical. Classical may be the best because they assumed that their audience was older. They had those big console systems at home. I think their goal to make accurate recordings of classical music, whether it was string quartets or operas or symphonies, I think they were more in that direction of really trying to capture what went down at the sessions. But not for popular music and not even for jazz. They weren't making documents of what it sounded like. They're not making them now, but they certainly weren't then. And they were thinking about how that music was going to sound to their audience, right? And had no idea of what the future would bring in terms of better and better quality up to a point. And then we get into this period we're in now where the average person who has any kind of music playback system has a Bluetooth speaker, under $100 Bluetooth speaker or free earbuds or crappy Bluetooth in-ear headphones or something. How most people hear music in the year 2019 is probably, well, it's more convenient now than it was then, but it probably doesn't sound much better now than it did 50 or even 60 years ago. So the recording engineers of each period have to be thinking about that. How is the audience going to hear it? And that's going to determine what they sound like. And I think that kind of accounts why music of our time right now sounds as bad as it does for the most part. Yes, there are exceptions, but it's massively compressed. It's massively processed to sound some version of good over pretty marginal playback gear. Now, how will people 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now look back on our time? They will probably be mystified because they say, well, they had the technology to make much better sounding recordings and not really be able to connect to why we didn't really try to make better sounding recordings. Unless they're watching my video right now, they won't know. No, obviously I'm joking. But seriously, this time that we're in the 21st century, these 19 years or 20, depending on how you count, or 18, won't be looked upon as a golden era for sound recording of any type of music, really. I think that holds true for classical music and jazz for the most part. It's not as good as it could or should be, and that is a shame. And that's lost because a lot of the artists and a lot of this music that's being recorded now is not being recorded in a way that will translate to people in the future, 20, 30, 40 years from now. I am concerned about that, but there's nothing I can do about it except make videos like this and hope. Well, I used to have this hope that engineers, producers, record companies would make two mixes of each song or album, right? The mix that sounds pretty much like what we have now, and then a better purist mix, less compressed, less processed, less for people who cared about sound quality, audiophile, the 1%, if you may. And I used to beat the drum to try to make that happen, and it was explained to me many times why that wasn't going to happen. one guy at Warner Brothers said to me, Steve, we have a hard enough time getting everybody to agree to one mix, much less say, okay, we're going to do 2 mixes, and you have to approve both of them. And they weren't going to make that much money from doing all the extra work of doing the second mix. So it wasn't going to happen unless the artists themselves wanted it to. Said, oh yeah, I want to make the compressed version and the better sounding version, or however they would describe it. But generally, that's not the case. Now, you might say, I know what you're thinking. What about the vinyl version? Well, sometimes the vinyl version of a given song is better, but it's still the same basic mix. It's just mastered in a maybe less processed, less compressed way. Maybe, or maybe not. Maybe it's the exact same as the MP3 version. Who knows? Well, some people know, actually, right? I think my work here is done for today. My name is Steve Guttenberg. This is the Audiophiliac Daily Show, and it does come up right now 5 or 6 days a week. If you dig it, please subscribe. Hit that button right down there, and when you do, you'll see a little icon of a bell, or a bell icon, right? And you have to hit that in order to be notified. If you just subscribe, you're not going to be notified for all the new episodes. So take that extra step. And by the way, speaking of extra steps, check out the playlist. I have playlists for speaker reviews and headphone reviews and music reviews and electronics reviews, all kinds of cool stuff, and lots of interviews with everyday audiophiles. Actually, they're not particularly everyday, but they're just like me and you, audiophiles, and also famous engineers and designers in the audio biz. So check out those playlists. You can follow me on Twitter at Audiophiliac Man. You can follow me on Instagram at steve.guttenberg. And best of all, you can check out my Patreon at patreon.com/ say it together, class, Audiophiliac. And as always, thank you so much for watching. And we're getting close. We're getting close to hitting 100,000 subscribers. So subscribe again. No, I'm just kidding. See you soon. Bye-bye.